we've gone into some incredible depth this weekend and then this morning about very specific issues about theories of consciousness, mechanisms, and things like that. What Antonio and I thought we would do in this chat together for the next 40 minutes is to really widen the scope. So, for example, in the strange order of things, you deeply go into not just consciousness, but the idea of culture. And the title of our conversation together is about mind, consciousness, the body, and relationships, and how these things pertain to both our personal well-being and planetary health. So the way we're going to do this is we can start with some introductory comments, and then Antonio and I are going to go back and forth. There's some specific things I want to make sure to ask you about. We've done a dialogue before, and it was incredibly rich, and so this is wonderful to be back here with you. So do you want to start with introductory comments, or would you like me to begin?
You start.
Okay. So the first thing I want to begin with here at Stanford is a very personal story that may relate to a lot of you. It's a painful story, and it has two parts. One was just across the street at the main high school here, the public school, Palo Alto High School. There were several young people who jumped in front of the train, and they had been filled with so much despair and disconnection within consciousness, felt so much suffering and didn't see any way out, that they killed themselves. So I was called, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, to come and do an intervention at the school. And in the months before I could get over here, 2 more children killed themselves just the week before I came. And they had me meet with the students, with the faculty, and with also people from the other school nearby. And then the students made a video, which you can actually watch, which they gave me permission to make available to everyone. And you'll see me talk to people who are unbelievably terrified. And in terms of consciousness, what came up in the discussions we had in all those settings was an incredible sense of not belonging, a feeling of despair, disconnection. And this was really painful, and you can watch the video if you want. But then actually a few months before that, Stanford Medical School had asked me to come and do the same thing for the entire medical faculty and nursing faculty, because as you probably know, there were several postgraduate trainees who killed themselves, physicians. And when the the dean of the medical school got up and said, here's the Mayo Clinic report, 56% of postgraduate physicians are clinically depressed, anxious, or suicidal. Over half of, you're a physician too, over half of people. And then right around that same time, I was speaking to 3,000 veterinarians who had achieved the highest rate of suicide. And that was for 3,000 people in the room. I did a small workshop with 700 of the veterinarians. One of them got up and took the microphone and said, I'm thinking of killing myself right now, in front of his colleagues. And the feeling was always, I don't belong, I'm disconnected, and I can't get this loop of thoughts out of me. So for me as a clinician, wanting to know the science of consciousness and to know about how we can actually do something in the world, it actually seemed sadly related to what's happening even with climate change issues, where people feel so disconnected from being a part of nature that they treat Earth like a spherical trash can. And there's this incredible despair. I was just with my daughters at Columbia in graduate school in environmental science. She invited me to a class on emotional resilience in the face of the climate crisis. And it may seem strange, but the suicide here at Stanford is not just at Stanford. It's not just in the high school. It's all around this country. We have a country here with incredible individualism. And in brain terms, you would say, oh, the default mode network is really excessively differentiated and people are just preoccupied, and if you want to do the brain side of this. And amazingly, just to stay with the brain, if you can reduce that people in the mindfulness community would tell you, and Shenzhen Yang and I were talking about this last night at the party, if you can reduce that excessive default mode activation of me, and drop into a state of awareness which gives you a feeling of connection, things shift. And so the last story I want to say about this, and this is just some introductory comments, I'm working with some people at MIT on something that Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer, two professors there, call generative social fields. Generative was mentioned earlier by our wonderful talk by our philosopher. And in that view, we're looking at how consciousness can allow people to feel incredibly separate. And when you go into a classroom, you can talk to students who feel disconnected, they don't belong there, there's just like perfunctory doing work. And we can study, and we are studying generative classrooms where teachers create a culture in the classroom where kids feel like they belong. And the whole mood in the room is different. And this is an amazing thing. So a number of the faculty went to a forest. And this is what I want to ask you about. We went to a forest, and we were asked to spend 3 days alone in the forest. And initially, you're by yourself. You're just with a creek, the sky. And after a few hours, I had the experience, and all of my colleagues, there were a dozen of us, had the same experience, where the sense of a separate self goes away. This is no drugs, it's just being in a forest. And you feel incredibly, I wouldn't even use the word connected, but you feel like you are a part of this nature, and that the body is an illusion to place the self only in that. And I know you've written deeply about the self. So the self is in a body as a me, but you feel this deep part of a we, and we would start talking about this term we, of you're both a bodily self and a cultural self, including all of nature. And this happened in this wheel of awareness practice we did yesterday, and it's happened to the 10,000 people that I've studied doing that, where people will get this feeling. And I'll just say this one last thing. In a parliament, I was asked to do this wheel. Lots of tension in the government. We do the wheel, which basically, Antonio, is where the knowing of consciousness is placed in a metaphoric hub of a wheel. The knowns are on the rim. And this happens over and over again, but I'll give you one specific example. A parliamentarian says during a break, I didn't want to share with my colleagues what it was like to get into that hub. And now he's crying. He says, but I've never felt so connected to everyone and everything, and I've never felt so much love. And he wouldn't say it to his colleagues because he said they'd think he was weak. And then I said to him, so let me understand something. When you're in pure awareness, you felt connected and loved. He goes, more than I've ever felt. Never meditated before in his life. And then I said to him, so when you're making national law, do you leave love out of the reasoning? And so he went over and he started chatting up his parliamentarian friends, and I hope they would bring that in. But this experience I want to just ask you about, of feeling connected to everything, feeling that the self, which you've written so beautifully about, is more than just your bodily experience. Yes, you have a body, more than just your brain, it's in a whole body, and all your work in homeostasis is so powerful. But I worry that the reason in medical school and in high schools people are killing themselves, literally, is because they're feeling so separate from the rest, as Einstein would say, this optical delusion of separation, that for planetary health and personal health, expanding that sense of self through really these methodologies of consciousness, which you can do, being in nature or even meditating. And so I just want to put all that out there, because I feel we're at this turning point in humanity where if we don't focus directly on the nature of consciousness and its impact on our personal and planetary well-being, whether it's for personal crisis or a climate crisis, we're not going to be going in a good direction. Those are my opening reflections to you.
Okay, very good. Well, that's very thoughtful, and I'm trying to think about where am I going to pick out of your many, many comments something that relates to me and that can relate to you and to everybody else in this conference. And the first thing that came to my mind actually has to do with reasons for connection. Of course, having a healthy life, going to the middle of a forest and being able to look around and calm down and reflect on your environment and on yourself calmly without any sort of pressure is extremely good. Knowing a little bit and divulging the knowledge that we now have about the interconnectivity of all ourselves is also very important. And I was thinking about the fact that if we pause a little bit to think about what we are made of, the kinds of cells that make up our organisms, not just the neural cells on which, of course, we have to be very interested if we're going to understand deeply things about the human mind, but cells in general, living cells that make up an organism. And if you think about the fact that plants around us are also made of cells, like we are, and can also be anesthetized. What I would like to call attention to is that we have a world that continues outside of ourselves into a world of other things that are living, and into a planetary world that needs to have certain kinds of interconnections for it to continue. So there is something that, let's just pick up on the notion of homeostasis, which is the notion that you can apply to a single cell and can apply to a whole organism. And actually you can apply at higher and higher levels to whole cultures and to a whole universe. That's something that is important for us to reflect on. The possibility that things have points of regulation. There are certain areas where the connections work well, and where the process, say the process of life, for example, continues, and certain conditions under which it goes down. And it would be good for us to have that notion very, very present, that the material that we are made of as human beings is not that different from the material that makes up plants and forests, and the kinds of regulation that apply to us as a whole organism are not that different from the ones that apply to the animals that we have around us. And that would be a beginning to have some more respect for all of those processes that are in our surround. So I think actually just plain knowledge of biology is very much needed and would be superb to have. And I think people would a lot of the conversations, for example, that we have in terms of animal rights and in terms of climate would be much easier if people would know more about biology and would know more about their biology and the biology of what is around, and notions of regulation and notions about processes that cannot or cannot be sustained if they are outside of certain ranges of equilibrium, for example. Then the other thing I was thinking about while you were talking is the fact that the kind of regulation that you want to have at the level of a single cell, even a single cell without a nucleus like a bacterium, and that you have in organisms with nervous systems, very simple ones, or in organisms with nervous systems like we are, tends to be repeated over and over. So the kind of equilibrium or ranges of possible life continuation that you have at the level of a cell, single cell, appear in organisms that are multicellular and have nervous systems. And what is interesting is that you can look at it as think about what is the charge of that nervous system. Charge in the sense of what kind of job does it have to do? Well, it turns out that the job that the nervous system has to do, in general, is do exactly the kind of homeostatic regulation that a single cell with no nervous system whatsoever already does, with things that are actually extremely similar in terms of the sociality of a single cell organism, the sociality of an organism that has multiple cells. And then something very intriguing is that the charge that we have when we have a mind, or the charge of a mind, or the charge of consciousness within the mind, or the charge of culture happens to be exactly the same. As far as I'm concerned, there is nothing terribly special about cultural developments that is not inscribed in the fundamental homeostasis of a single cell or of an organism with multiple cells. And I think the nervous system is actually the instrument that continues that homeostatic direction into organisms that have brains eventually, and that culture just continues that. You think, for example, of economic systems. Think of justice. Think of morality. Think of the development of the arts. And think of what we do when we do science and technology. We are essentially procuring homeostatic possibilities, and we are finding ways in which it can operate. Now, to go into the area of dysfunction that you talked about, because when you're talking about suicide, especially massive suicides like you're describing, you have to think that something is very badly regulated at that point for that to go so badly. And there you can point to certain things that are happening, for example, in our culture, and I'm not talking about the United States in particular, although we're pretty bad at it. And we have, for a variety of reasons, first of all, we have access to a tremendous amount of knowledge, not the beautiful kind of knowledge that one can sort of trace back to, say, the past century with people like William James or Claude Bernard, who, by the way, was an incredibly important force in the development of an understanding of how the botanical world is so close to ours and how it responds in very similar ways. But other kinds of knowledge that we have all around and that very often generate conflict by the sheer abundance. And one of the things that I think is very problematic in our culture, again, not just ours here, but culture in general, you find it all over the sort of advanced countries, is that you have a very rapid presentation of knowledge because you don't have time to think about the knowledge and reflect and be able to see the pros and cons of a certain idea, you very rapidly generate the conflict. And then you have on top of that the fact that a lot of news media and a lot of the very interesting developing in our culture, which is social media, actually procures conflict and generates conflict by rapid juxtaposition of things that are very inimical, and it actually entices you to responses that search for the worst in our emotional armamentarium. So when people talk about emotion and talk about emotion too positively, I caution, because a lot of our big sets of emotions are actually negative, and they have extremely forceful negative feelings that come with them. And so I think that's part of the problem. But what in response to your very beautiful description of all these dramas that are going around, I would say that there are things that can explain them at the cultural level, but I would again bring back the fact that culture is just one way in which our biology is functioning, and that it's becoming sick.
It's becoming sick, and one of the things you mentioned was kind of a reality of our interconnection, and yet, like in these social media things you're referring to, the studies are very clear. When people spend more time on social media, they actually feel more disconnected, and there's more an emphasis on the idea of a solo self, that you're just who you are, your identity is just separate. And I was reviewing not only The Strange Order of Things, which is a fabulous book, everyone should read it, but also The Self Comes to Mind, and you make these very powerful distinctions among things like mind, and then we can add to that consciousness, right? So the consciousness experience, self-experience, mind experience, you distinguish those in some really helpful ways, which I think would be great to talk about. But also what we're talking about now is culture, which you really address in The Strange Order of Things. And in our discussion here, thinking that a culture could be sick and not doing its homeostatic thing, part of what comes out right now between us is the idea that if a culture is giving a message of separation, that who we are is just a person in a head or a separate being just in a body, and that in fact our relationships with one another, whether it's parents with children or families or neighborhoods where you feel like you belong, and this whole sense, I think that Heather's beautiful talk ended with, if I got it right, belonging and awe. If you look at the studies of belonging and awe and add to them, you know, the studies of gratitude and the studies of compassion, though they're called self-transcendent emotions, with Dacher Keltner, we teach a lot together and he studies them. I suggest to him, instead of calling it self-transcendent, like you're leaving the self, what about self-extending or self-expanding? And I wanted to ask you about that, is in our culture, if we think from this conference forward, what's a way you take all this powerful stuff we've been talking about and actually turn it into action in the world, let's say for our culture, so that instead of the self only being as separate, only existing in your head or your body, you realize your relationships, and I want to ask you how you feel about this, your relationships are one aspect of a more integrated way of looking at the self.
I don't have any problem with that, obviously. You know, I think you have all the possibilities, and it's really a question. First of all, it's a question of common sense, and then a question of wisdom. Common sense being on the way to wisdom, to how to regulate your life and your relationships. And I mean, I think in a way we're victims of an enormous success. We have the successes of our accumulation of knowledge, the accumulation of knowledge that comes from science and comes from observations of every kind. The amount of knowledge that we're generating is huge, and it's wonderful. I mean, you look at the conference like this, and it's actually one of the biggest collections of new findings and novelty in a variety of areas of science around mind and specific problem of consciousness, and around the ways in which philosophy is trying to cope with it as it should, because it's a sort of conscience of what is going on at a particular knowledge moment. So that's wonderful. But at the same time, the riches are so much. Who in this room can cope with all of these findings and all of this accumulation of knowledge sensibly and in a productive way? Of course, you need to go by steps, and it's a slow digestion. But then there's the fact that marvelous development, the marvelous developments of technology, the rapidity with which we get all of this, create those conflicts that I refer to in relation to social media, which is, of course, a good thing to begin with, but can be misused. And the general idea that not only is it difficult to manage, but all of this can be misused. And, you know, and let's think that at the level of a culture, at the level of the polis of a society, there are good actors and bad actors. You know, we cannot. Especially when you ask questions like the ones you're asking, it's not just about science and rational processes going forward. It's the fact that we live in large communities, and there are people in those communities that are wonderful and that have good intents, which I presume is the intents of most of the people, or all the people in this room, like you. And then there are people that are bad actors, and they have all sorts of reasons why they want to achieve certain results that may be good for them and for a small group, and that can be disastrous for others. All you need to do is look at what is happening in the world in terms of politics, in terms of societies, in terms of all the conflicts that we get if you look at the New York Times, or some other paper.
Absolutely. Well, you know, there's a set of research studies that are either called terror management studies or mortality salient studies, same set of studies, which I think are very relevant to what you're saying. When you get the experience of threat, even if it's subliminal, shown to you less than 200 milliseconds, when they study the brain of the subject who is getting that mortality salience stimulus, what seems to happen is that the brain intensifies its evaluative process to say, is the person I'm seeing in my in-group, in which case I'll treat them with more kindness, other studies would show, or is this person in front of me in my out-group, in which case I'll treat them with more hostility. And when you follow those studies forward, if you've evaluated a person as, quote, not like me, for whatever criteria that are being used at that moment, in the brain, the circuitry of both empathy and compassion is shut off. And you're looking at the person in front of you, who you put in the out-group under threat conditions, as if they're just a piece of dirt, that they don't have a subjective feeling state, an internal mind, if you will, and then you just treat them in a dehumanizing way. So part of, I think, the question we can ask from this conference is there a way to awaken people to the biology of things, even to our inherited tribalism of in-group, out-group distinction, and realize we actually have consciousness that can raise us above our biological vulnerabilities to be othering people. And there's a wonderful professor named John A. Powell who says beautifully that the opposite of othering is not saming, it's belonging. And can we actually open people up to saying, you belong. You may not be exactly like the person who has this skin color, this religion, or whatever, but you belong. And even with what you said earlier, Antonio, that, although this is plastic, I think, but if this were, the cells of a, or maybe it's real. No, I think it's plastic. Anyway, assuming this were real, you say you're like me because we're living organisms that rely on homeostasis. So when you breathe in, I breathe out. When I breathe out, you breathe in. This kind of beautiful way we're interconnected. So I'm just wondering what you feel.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Stay there. Stay there. Don't go anywhere else. I mean, that's the important thing, is to think, even in relation to ourselves. Look, we breathe oxygen that comes not from that plastic plant, but from other plants. I mean, if you don't have the plants around, you're not going to have oxygen to breathe. And don't be nasty to bacteria, because they're in our gut. And if you don't have the bacteria in your gut, you're going to die. So actually, you have all sorts of levels at which the biology can, knowing about biology is really the summary of this conversation on my side is study biology in general, not just neurobiology, and get to know about these interconnections. And just think of that. The oxygen you breathe comes from the world of plants. Those plants that are living, that do not have anything that resembles consciousness, and that yet you can anesthetize with Stewart's anesthetics.
They have microtubules.
Exactly. Then think about the fact that you cannot live with the bacteria that are, in fact, extremely numerous, that are not only in our gut, but everywhere, and in different groups, and in different parts of our skin, and different organs, and so forth. So there is an integration of this living world that is that we are testimonies to, and that is very important to realize.
And yet, why do you think the human condition, and in particular individualistic cultures, can generate a state of awareness that then would include, and you see this as a clinician, I see this sadly so often in psychotherapy, as a psychotherapist, people feeling all I am is in this body, I'm just separate, and there's this incredible loop of despair where it's like, okay, I just need to accumulate material things for my well-being, but then I don't feel particularly good that way, and there's not a relational world in which this person lives, and then to gently and lovingly kind of support them, saying, well, actually, who you are, yes, is a body, but if you got the message somewhere along the way that all that you are is just your body, it's actually, all the studies show, going to lead to all sorts of terrible things in your body and in your mind and all these things like that.
Then we're back to the fact that cultures can develop marvelous things and can develop bad things. And we're going through a period in which we have both in spades, but in which the bad things are taking quite a lot of prominence.
Yeah.
I think it's quite yesterday at lunch, somebody asked a very interesting question. What was the thing that had most surprised me recently? And I think most surprises me recently is the collapse of democracies across the world. And it's something I would never have been able to predict, and plenty of people would not have been able to predict. In fact, many people have very foolishly predicted exactly the opposite, that we were in the best of all possible worlds, and that we were living in a new enlightenment, and it was going to be just peachy going forward. And what we have witnessed is the collapse of one Western democracy after another, and now many other neo-democracies in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely spectacular, and that is, if you don't believe in conspiracies, and I don't think that there's a conspiracy for that to happen, what there is a conspiracy, quote unquote, that comes from the fact that at the same time, huge numbers of people are being confronted with very similar problems. Economic problems, problems of realization of what their lives are like and their social groups are like, and all of this can then be properly manipulated by, again, things that naturally are coming up in the culture, in any culture, which have to do with defense mechanisms, which are in of themselves very homeostatic, but can be good homeostatic defenses or bad. You can have, for example, you can have an immune system that is very useful to you, but it can malfunction and produce anaphylactic shocks, for example. Mm-hmm. So all of these are pathologies. And again, the thing that you're provoking me in the good sense of the term, of course, something that is very dear to me, which is the trying to find homologies in different levels of biology. And it's cultures are eminently biological. You have all of these actors, the cells of a culture are the people that are actors in the culture, but the modes of operation are extremely limited. And again, go back to something very simple like a bacterium or colonies of bacteria. And you find that the sociality of these creatures is quite extraordinary. How you can have groups of these creatures who clearly are not thinking creatures, and we have absolutely no apparatus to produce anything like mental images, maps, or anything of that sort, but who do have the possibility of sensing a stimulus and creating a response. But these creatures can group themselves and create alliances. They can then fight other groups, or they can create coalitions, as if you had just come to a political treaty. Mm-hmm. and solve problems that way. Yeah. So the idea that we, very smart human beings, invented cultures and invented politics and things of that sort is complete rubbish, because those simple creatures are already operating and in fact predicting a tremendous amount of the phenomena that we can find at individual level or at social level, which is quite remarkable. So, and just one more thing to get us a little bit out of your track, but a bit back into the track of the not only today but the day before, is this idea that we can gain something from understanding how minds operate and understanding how minds develop this particular feature that we talk about called consciousness. I think actually I was listening to, of course, many of the speakers this morning, and I have an impression that making a distinction between mind processes in general and conscious mind processes is something that is worth doing and maintaining. Because I think when Stuart talks beautifully, as he just did, and summarizes a lot of his work, I think that he's, to say that that has to do with consciousness is too modest a claim. You should be bolder and say, no, I am talking about a certain number of mechanisms that are probably quite relevant to the generation of mental phenomena, of mental experiences. And then there are certain of those mental phenomena that can have the quality of experience, and that's when they really have a reference to a particular organism, and when that reference is accompanied, as I believe, by a feeling that has to do with the being of the creature, which is very primordial, which has nothing to do with us knowing languages and being able to communicate with each other, all of those marvelous things. It's something much deeper than that. But it's worth thinking about a fabric of mind, which we all share, and that has, we have to go, we don't have anywhere to go but deep in the structure. And, he's very fond of microtubules, so am I, because, thank you for mentioning Alzheimer's disease today, which was interesting. When people think about Alzheimer's disease and they start talking about amyloid plaques, I get an allergy reaction, because the microtubules are where the disease is, and he knows how that functions. So just
and how does the quantum perspective that Stuart has been talking about in the microtubules, or just in general, how does that fit into your view of mind?
It fits perfectly well. If I knew what he does, I probably would be working on what he does. But since I don't, I work at a different level. I'm interested in knowing how feelings operate. That's the business of my life, and I'm very happy that feelings contribute to the generation of consciousness in the narrow sense, which is really understanding consciousness as a systems level phenomenon, as opposed to consciousness in the broader sense of mental phenomena, which is what I think he talks about and many others talk about. That's deeper. He's talking about something deeper.
Yeah.
I think you can understand how consciousness is made, how consciousness is concocted, by understanding the systems level arrangement. And there you don't need to worry at that point. You don't need to worry about what's going on in the quantum world and at the level of microtubules, for example. You're higher up.
One last question about systems levels. Do you see there's a systems level for consciousness in culture?
Say again?
When you're talking about systems
Yeah.
of level, we're looking at things, and you've written about culture.
Yeah.
How does consciousness fit in with your view of culture? And also specifically, this group, what can we do in our culture as a humanity on the planet to try to bring things in a positive direction?
You see, let's go back to something. Today, Neil Seth said something very interesting. He quoted a guy who was complete anathema to me, and that was Stuart Sutherland. And he had the quote, by the way, when I wrote Descartes, I think it was in Descartes Error, I have that entire quote, and I put it on purpose. I put it at the very beginning of the book. And then I was completely undone by the fact that Stuart Sutherland wrote a positive review of Descartes Error in Nature. And I expected the guy to completely hate me, and the guy wrote this very nice review. Now, think about what that man said, Stuart Sutherland. He said, nobody has ever understood. The gist of it is that you don't know what it is, you don't know what it's good for, nobody has any clue how it works. And this was the most nihilistic view possible. And I was exactly on the opposite side. And what I wanted is to say, this is rubbish. Of course we can understand it, provided we're given time and money. This is for David. Is David still here? Yeah, provided we have time and money, we can get to know everything. Okay, there's nobody for NIH. Where was I?
The larger, yeah.
Exactly. So the critical thing is that consciousness is useful. So if you have a mind process, but the mind process does not have this curlicue called consciousness, this reference to an organism, how would that organism care and give a hoot about doing good or bad, doing something useful or not? That's the beauty of it. And contrary to Stuart Sutherland, we know what is the role of consciousness. The role of a conscious moment is to make the creature that has it aware of the goodness or badness of what the creature is about to do or what the creature has just experienced. That's it, and that's useful. Now, that's projected into the culture. That's exactly what culture does. And when you have an organized cultural system, you have the possibility of finding things that are useful or not useful, that point not just for one person, but for a group. And so that denial of the usefulness of consciousness is crazy. But here, again, you have multiple levels. There's the level of usefulness that only comes if you refer the thing to yourself. And then there's the level of usefulness that comes from you even having the possibility of knowing anything, which is, of course, what is given by mind in the raw state.
Beautiful. I think we could talk for another few days, but I think the clock has told us, at least in this part of the universe, time has come to a stop. But Antonio, I want to thank you. This was really, really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It was fun. Cheers.